share with you what this photograph means to me. In January, Alan Alda visited ASU, and Boyd and I had a chance to sit down with him and talk about improvisational theater. If you're not aware, Alan is now essentially touring the country, visiting a number of universities, leading workshops to take physical scientists and engineers through some of the improvisational theater exercises that have been well known for decades, to get them to improve their presentation and performance skills. In particular, Alan is concerned about the degree to which a scientist or an engineer can empathize with their audience. So this is a really nifty meeting that we had, but watching Hawkeye, for me, in real life, you know, it reminds me of my experiences with the virtual Alan Alda that I grew up with. It reminds me about MASH when it got really good. It was really a modern morality play. It was exploring the moral and ethical themes in this context of war. Every episode was a contest between the different moral theories that could play to any dilemma that the characters were facing. And we can see these play out in a way that has been fascinating to human beings for thousands of years. It isn't going away. So I'm going to come back to this engineering ethics theme and how we use theater to teach these different moral theories in a way that hopefully they stick. But I'm going to go further back than that. It was not always. Alda's theme when he's on tour is bringing science and art back together, but it was not always that these were separate. I'm going back to the Renaissance, and we think of Leonardo as typifying the Renaissance man who could do it all. It was back here that the scientists and the artists were the same people. It's because both science and art at this time was attempting to describe the world around us. So the artists would use technique to reproduce the world. The scientists would investigate the world, and this painting from Rembrandt shows kind of the intersection of the two. But things didn't stay in the Renaissance for long. There is a relationship between technique and technology. We think of technology as sort of the physical artifacts now of the techniques of science. So a computer we think of as technology as if it were a noun. But if I take that word literally, it means the study of technique. Certainly artists have their technique now, scientists and engineers have their technology. But the changes in technology, of course, feed back into the science and into the art. Here, there were two important changes. The first being the invention of the printing press. The printing press allowed us to amplify our communication. Instead of communicating orally, as we're doing now, which is limited in its bandwidth, instead of me reading to you a book that then you would scribe over for yourself, because it's the only way to reproduce books, now I can print them out and broadcast them to a wider audience that amplifies my message. So that's one technological leap forward that was important in the development of science and the separation of science from art. But the other one was technological enhancement of our senses. So now it's no longer just the naked eye or the ear or any of the other senses that allow us to observe the universe. It is the telescope or the microscope that enhances these observations. We can now see the world in a way that had never been revealed to us before because of the technology, and then we can describe the world in a way to more people than ever before as a result of the printing press. So Galileo, for me, exemplifies the beginning of this schism between art and science, and it was partly his preoccupation with measurement that distinguished the scientist from the artist. Before Galileo, just the way in which we measured, the number systems that we used, how we accounted for things were not fully formed. For Galileo, measurement and mathematics were an innovation in how to represent and understand the world. It moved us from what I have on the left-hand side here, the static and the retrospective of preoccupation with the sensory and the subjective, towards the right-hand side, the predictive, the abstract, mathematical being an abstract way to represent the world. And moving from the subjective to what Galileo and others believe was the objective. So here we see a transition in what some of the people are doing in their approach to careful observation of the world and describing it in a different way. This coincided with a preoccupation in the Renaissance that artists had with realism. The more realistic their paintings became, the better their paintings were considered. Well, the scientists took realism to mean something a little bit different. So there was an objective truth that could be revealed, not just in a painting, but through mathematics. And that the test of whether it was true or not was its predictive capacity. So here we see the origins of science and what's important in science beginning to differentiate a little bit from the artists. But when a new branch of science emerges, this is ecology, this is the 19th century, we see that science and art are still threaded together. That is, it's only after the discipline of science becomes codified and regimented that it departs from science. These are Charles Darwin's sketches of finches on the Galapagos Island. If you know your Charles Darwin, he recognized that these finches, which were all related, had developed different bills on different islands. This is the way Darwin made his careful observations of the world around him. It was with what I would call a number 2 pencil, I don't know, that he was using, but it's in a sketchbook that Darwin created these careful observations and was able to note the differences in the bills. We wouldn't do this anymore. You no longer have to have highly refined sketching skills in order to be an ecologist. Instead, you only need an iPhone with a camera. So because technology has advanced, the ecologist can lose touch with the artistic technique. Here we see the substitution of technology for technique again. I'm going to go a little bit further, sticking with ecology. This is issue number 1, journal number 1 from a journal called Soundscapes. And this was introduced to me by a friend named Brian Pichanowski at Purdue University, who's a soundscape ecologist. What he does is he goes out into the world, nature mostly, but all different kinds of environments, and records what he hears. So now we're talking about technological enhancement of our hearing, not our vision with Galileo and the telescope. And the soundscape ecologists categorize what they hear by several different ways. One might be what's called the biophony. These are the sounds of living organisms, mosquitoes, and frogs, and bird calls. There's also the geophony. They're not alive, but they're natural. It could be thunder. It could be trees falling. It could be these physical sounds that don't result from, I suppose trees can be biophony too. A creek bed, for example, would be the geophony. And then there's the, not sure whether it's called anthrophony or technophony. It depends on who you're talking to. The sound of cars, the sounds of people, the sounds of the technological artifacts that exist in our landscape. Right now, there's very little distinction between the artist and the scientist in soundscape ecology. They use the technology given to them, or that they develop themselves in order to make and record these observations. But the group, the community of soundscape ecologists, includes the musicians. It includes the people who are attuned to sound and understand sound at this artistic level, because they don't yet know how to parse or analyze the sounds that they're recording in these different environments. So partly because Brian helped inspire it, we ran a workshop in which we explored music as a vehicle for collaboration and communication among science teams. It turned out to be a pretty powerful workshop for me, in which I realized that different instruments, which are written in different keys, present obstacles to playing together. That if we didn't have the communicative facility to work across those keys, to translate from, for example, B-flat clarinet to whatever that guitar was tuned in, I don't know, then we couldn't work together, which is a metaphor for how theater and engineering, for example, are trying to collaborate, because we communicate in, metaphorically speaking, different keys with different vocabularies, and we need to become versed enough in the other's instrument in order to be able to work in harmony. That was a lesson. The point I'm making is that as science emerges, it starts from this point where the science and the art are well integrated, and again we see this pattern of later divergence. Here again is the technological enhancement of our observation. This is the microphone pack that the soundscape ecologists will hang off a tree, or hide in a box, or hide, for example, in the city. so that it can record what we hear. There's 2 minutes and 20 seconds of sound on here that I'm not going to play for you. But instead, I'm going to show us what's happening in the technological amplification of communication. This is the Darwins Health. Right now, we have a myriad of communication choices available to us. It's no longer just the print version of the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions. The winnower is an alternative platform for publishing science. And the metaphor of the Darwins Selfie is that the fittest platforms for publication will survive. The winner is attempting to crowd out, by reshaping the way we publish science, crowd out the 500-year-old technology and incorporate the new digital technologies that will allow science to be more responsive, more rapid, more inclusive. As you record sounds with the device on the left, you can now upload them to this website called FreeSound, where soundscape ecologists are sharing their data, even before the data is processed or analyzed or published. Now we can be a soundscape ecologist without the expense of traveling to Borneo and hanging these microphones off of trees in the rainforest, because we have access to what other soundscape ecologists are recording. I think that's pretty neat. Data alone is insufficient, because data is not synonymous with information. Information is not synonymous with knowledge, and knowledge is not synonymous with meaning. Scientists are really good in the upper left-hand corner of this inequality equation that I've written for you, but they're not good in the lower right-hand corner. This is another motivation to integrate the scientist with the artist, because in the lower right-hand corner is the purview of the humanists and the creatives, the writers and the artists. In the upper left-hand, the purview of the scientist. The challenge now is to thread the upper left-hand corner with the lower right-hand corner so that people can understand what the data means. Well, how do we do that? It turns out that we do that by telling stories. It's an exercise in sense-making. Making sense of things that are complicated and complex requires that we turn them back into stories, which is not what Galileo was suggesting at all. Galileo, all he saw were stories, and he wanted them to become mathematical, measurable, and concrete so that they could be predictive and provable. We've done that job. Now we need to reconvert them back into things that people can understand. And there's a lot of scientific evidence that suggests the way people make sense of complex and complicated things is by turning them into these narratives. This brings us back to Alan Alda's point, that if you want people to understand the science that you're doing, then you have to be able to create a story out of this science, a story that has some tension, that has characters, that has a point that people can relate to. So we use stories to teach ethics. Does anybody recognize this photo? This is 1986. This is the Challenger explosion. We use this story as a case study. Now it's historical, it's retrospective, and because it's a story, it's fictionalized. It's based upon true events, but we present to the students an oversimplified version of the Challenger explosion and the scientists and engineers that were involved in the decision to launch on that cold day in Florida. And then we explore them as characters, not as people. We do this all the time. This is the Ford Pinto. So this is a series of photographs from a test site of the Ford Pinto. As you know, in the 70s, if you struck the Ford Pinto from behind in a certain way, at a certain speed, the gas tank blew up. Ford did an infamous study that was represented in an internal memo in which they calculated the cost of compensating the victims of the gas tank to the cost of repairing all the gas tanks. And they decided compensating the victims was cheaper. So think about that. It's cheaper to incinerate your customers than it is to improve your vehicles. And the recommendation that came out of the engineering team that did the analysis was compensate the victim. So this is an infamous case study with what we would call a clear-cut failure of professional ethics. Lastly, this is the Citicorp Tower. This is meant to be a positive case study. Again, a fictionalized and oversimplified story based upon true events. The notch you see here in the bottom of the Citicorp Tower, which is in Manhattan, was so that they could build the tower around a church, which sounds like a wonderful thing to do. But structurally, they didn't quite understand how the dynamics of the tower under wind load would respond when there was a notch at a critical corner like this. Sure enough, a student at Princeton University who, as part of her senior project, was analyzing the wind loads and the reaction of the tower, looked at those reactions and said it didn't make any sense to her how the tower could withstand those loads. She wrote to the structural engineer who discovered that they'd made a horrible mistake and had to retrofit the connections within the tower, strengthen them all so they could withstand hurricane-force winds. So we use this story as a positive ethical example of someone who took responsibility for failure that they didn't intend to make. They didn't make out of selfish purposes, but they were obliged to correct. Here's the problem with the way we teach ethics right now. This oversimplified, retrospective account creates two types of characters, the bad apples and the good whistleblowers. The way we teach ethics lacks the moral complexity that I was seeing in the MASH episodes, where it wasn't clear what the right thing to do was. Or maybe the difficulty was between two right things, not between right and wrong. When we present it now in the context of professional ethics, inevitably our students respond with this oversimplified black and white view of the world, and they say, I would never have launched the Challenger at 32 degrees. I would never have written a memo that would, recommend incineration of my customers. And I would, of course, I would retrofit every single bolted connection within the Citicorp Tower and weld them to their full strength. The students in this view are all moral saints. They're a bit detached from the characters. I mean, the stories are good in the sense that there are characters they can relate to, but they always relate to the good ones, the heroes in the stories. Then, when they find themselves immersed in their own moral quandary, they don't recognize it. Because we're teaching them right now to recognize these morality plays, not these real moral situations. That presented me as an engineering instructor with a bit of dilemma. So I started thinking, what can we do to improve upon this storytelling, is what we call case study approach to teaching ethics, that in the end leads our student. Wait a minute, that's not one of my students. That's the delegation from France at the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen several years ago. And that's what it feels like to go through a lot of the ethics instruction that we do, where you're a passive receptor of what feels like somebody else's problem. This is what we do now. It came to me in the throes of a game addiction that I experienced 6 years ago when my son was 12. And my son was really into this game called Tribal Wars. He's in, 7th grade. The thing about the way this game works is you get a village, you invest in technologies. It's a very engineering-oriented kind of game. It has this medieval sort of context. Of course, you want to build up soldiers, and when you're strong enough, you want to go take over other people's villages. And my son is getting to a certain level in this game, and then he gets his village up to a certain size, and of course people take it all over and steal all this stuff. He comes to me and he says, Dad, my problem is that I go to school. Because this game runs 24 hours a day. And so he goes to school, and some, Russian kid or something who gets out of school while he's in social studies gathers up all his soldiers and steals his stuff. I'm like, okay, I see your problem, son. He says, Dad, you go to school, but you get to be on the computer all day. Would you mind just logging in, check on my village every once in a while? You could move my soldiers around or something. I just, keep me intact until I get out of school and I get to play again. And I'm like, or you, son. I'll check in. And I get so into this game that I start my own villages, and I got my own username and everything like that. Next thing you know, and this is like a couple or three, I'm embarrassed to say, a few weeks later, I'm the number 4 player in the world. I'm not kidding. Because, I'm going up against a bunch of Danish 12-year-olds or something. I'm like, how hard could this be to figure out? Well, the premise of the game is that you're supposed to form tribes. It works like this. All the little fish that band together, the way this game is structured, can defeat the one big fish. But I'm not going to form any tribes, right? I'm so smart. I've got my doctorate, and I can play 24 hours a day. So I'm the big fish that's trying to eat up all the little fish, and they keep climbing up the ranks until, frankly, the little fish get pissed. Unbeknownst to me, they form this massive coalition. And they're like, we're going to take this guy down. One morning I wake up and there are 11,000 incoming attacks, which really impressed my son. He's like, wow, Dad, you're kind of important, you know? You're screwed, but I'm impressed. First 1,000 attacks, they go pretty well. I lose like 2 villages. I'm not sleeping for more than 45 minutes at a time right now, because you can't let too much go in this game. You constantly have to be moving things around. But again, I have the admiration of my son. He's like, wow, I can't believe, you're doing so well. What are you going to do with the next 10,000 attacks? I'm like, I'm not sure how long I can keep this up. But think about what it's like to be one of these little fish. These kids are pissed. And so they redouble their efforts. Now they're like 22,000 attacks and the server crashes. Thank goodness the server crashes, because otherwise I might be living underneath a park bench in Rochester, New York or something like this. I had totally lost control of my life. The server shuts down and I kind of come back to reality and I'm like, what am I doing? I realized that in this non-cooperative game theoretic dynamic, that all of these people who had organized against me have created their own ethical principles about how to coordinate their actions. They're negotiating these principles on bulletin boards. They're saying, when are you justified in attacking someone? When are you justified in showing mercy? What are your obligations to other people in your tribes? I'm like, holy crap, they're running this whole ethics experiment and they're not watching other people, characters, wrestle with fictional ethical dilemmas. They're experiencing these ethical dilemmas for themselves. Now I agree, it's a virtual world, but it is theater in which the audience is participating in the play. The National Science Foundation should pay for that. That was my first thought. So we wrote a grant to the National Science Foundation. We said, this is a breakthrough, potentially, in ethics education. And they agreed. They said, work those games out. Now we play them on Twitter. There's one running right now. And guess what? Our server is down. Because it turns out as people get enthusiastic about these things, it's really hard to keep up with the pace. They're constantly doing things that surprise us, but we created this phishing game in which you're supposed to manage your resources and that kind of thing. It's all text-based on Twitter, which makes it accessible to people around the world. Even if they're in a narrow bandwidth, low computing environment, you can play this on a flip phone in East Africa. If you do it with 65 of your classmates, you will crash Twitter in East Africa for 3 days. Not that I'm speaking from experience, but that happened. But you can play in India, you can play in New Zealand. We can play 24 hours a day, the exact same way that we did the tribal board, but with lower bandwidth to reach a broader population. Another thing we're doing is experimenting with play. We wrote another grant to the National Science Foundation, and we said we want to create a playful environment to allow people to communicate in more ways than just linguistically, not just their words. We want people to communicate through their actions, through their behaviors, and we call this material deliberation. Communicate through the Lego models that they built. The National Science Foundation thought this was another good way to experiment with teaching social and ethical implications of nanotechnology. Last thing that we're doing is improvisational theater. So you see, here I kind of screwed up my animation. I'm at the Science Slam Festival in Guadalajara, Mexico. This group in the upper right-hand corner is called the Big Bang Theory. They're all doctoral level scientists. That's my friend Marga Gual next to me in the right-hand corner. She invited me, and this was so successful that we hired her at ASU. And I hope to bring the Science Slam Festival to ASU. In the lower right-hand corner, you can see me improving an improv workshop. This is at the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, meeting in San Jose, California. Someone from the Aldous Center was supposed to show up and lead an improvisational theater workshop to train scientists on how to communicate. They canceled at the last minute. But 20-something people showed up. And they're like, well, what are you going to do? Well, clearly we're going to improv an improv workshop. So I did some of the exercises that I've learned from Boyd. He calls this one Colombian hypnosis. And you can see some smiles on the faces of the participants, because these are fun, and they get us connected to people in this way that we're able to build empathy with our audience. So see, there's 3 different projects that we're working on to try and integrate the arts into science to understand these social and ethical implications and help us communicate. And this is what we found. When we work this way, we move our students from spectators to players, from passive to active, from apathetic to emotionally invested, from these narratively closed historical scripts where, I mean, spoiler alert, it blows up. We knew that, but now we put them in these experimentally open spaces where we're not sure if they're facing catastrophe, the tragedy of the commons, or salvation through cooperation. And of course, we move them from predictable to surprising. I think this is an improvement. Let me tell you why engineers need to move from the left hand to the right hand side. It's because we no longer work in an industrial world. We no longer work in a world where we can predict the future by extrapolating the past. This is, you think there's some crazy weather in New York right now that prevents Howard Sherman from flying into Phoenix? This is Phoenix in September 2014. This is what over 5.5 inches of rain looked like in Phoenix. Now to put that in perspective, we only get 8 inches of rain a year. Here we got 5.5. That broke the previous record by almost 2 inches. In other words, it shattered the previous meteorological record. So I went to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website. I downloaded some data. These are called depth, duration, frequency diagrams. This is like real engineering stuff. This is the only quantitative graph, only data that you're going to see during my presentation. But look, I have real data. I plotted the 24-hour precipitation from September 9th on these depth, duration, frequency. And what it tells us is how often would we expect a storm of that magnitude? And the answer is every 2,000 years. I asked my class, where do we get meteorological records that would describe for us the 2,000-year flood? And they're like, those records don't exist. I go, yes, they do. We call that the First Testament. Do you remember your Ghostbusters, where they're talking like disaster of biblical proportions? This is what we're talking about, the 2,000-year flood. This is the radar forecast 1 week later, and it shows the same levels of precipitation. If this is supposed to happen every 2,000 years, then why is it coming twice in 1 week? Because we can no longer predict the future based upon an extrapolation of the past. What's happening in our atmosphere is so extraordinary that all of our previous experience goes out the window. Think about what I'm asking engineers to do, to go from predictable to surprising, from closed to open, from passive to active, from spectators to players. This is why. Because during their careers, they are going to be surprised by the conditions under which they have to operate. And unless you think that's an isolated case, this is Toronto. This goes back a little bit further. I use this as an instructional tool to help students understand how everything is connected. This was 8 inches of rain over 2-3 days in Toronto. And it overwhelmed this culvert that went underneath Finch Ave. This culvert is supposed to carry the flow from the Black Creek. Once the Black Creek overtopped Finch Ave, it eroded away the pavement, it eroded away the subbase and the embankment, and exposed all of these utilities. Underneath Finch Ave was a major gas line, the largest fiber optic bringing communications into Toronto, the sewer line that had to be shut down. You can see some of the other power lines. This worker right here, he's walking on the collapsed sidewalk that is still being held together by some of the weak reinforcing steel. In other words, what looks like an isolated failure was on the brink of shutting down the communications, water treatment, sewage disposal, and, power systems, and natural gas systems of the entire city of Toronto. This is kind of a big deal, and there's no answer in the back of the book for how we're going to work through problems that we face in the 21st century. I submit to you that engineers, faced with this kind of problem, have to improvise their way through. So this brings me to my last point, which is one of the themes of the conference here. This oxymoron called science fiction. Science is about truth, that objective, provable truth that is empirically verifiable through prediction. Fiction is about making stuff up. So how can there be science and fiction together in the same phrase? They separated in the Renaissance, and even when they sort of start together at the beginning of a new discipline, we see this sort of inevitable separation take place over time, with the objective and the real on the left, and the abstract, the imaginary on the right. But it is the privilege of the engineer to work in the middle. Because this is what design disciplines do. Howard Sherman, I read, is an architect, which is another design discipline. When you think about what engineers and architects do, they start over on the right, in their imagination. And it is their job to create, in the real world, what previously only existed in their imagination. How do they do this? They go from imagination to, in engineering, what we call plans and specifications. They create mathematical, sometimes physical, and certainly digital models of the thing that they want to exist in reality. They transverse from fiction back to the real world by understanding the constraints. By constraints, I mean the natural laws of the universe. Could be the second law of thermodynamics, which, by the way, does not bind the artist, but it does bind the engineer. So now I feel like my profession is well positioned, even if we don't recognize it, to bring the science and the fiction together. This is our job. I call it our privilege, because what kind of hubris do you have to be the guy who goes out there and be like, this is a gorgeous desert. You know what we should have? It's probably like a Walmart and a few tract homes and maybe a culvert over here and a highway. I think it would be a much better world like that. This is what engineers do. It's not what scientists would tolerate. Scientists are meant to be detached and descriptive. Engineers are prescriptive. We're going to make the world a better place by rearranging it in accordance with the way we think it ought to be. So how does fiction help us do that? When we participate in science fiction, we are over here on the right-hand side, stimulating the moral imagination. What if the world looked like this? What if the world looked like that? How would we feel about it then? Is that the world that we want? And we have to try these on, like the actors in My Game, and experiment with different versions of the world to see how they relate to our values. We have no real experience with these imagined worlds that we're trying to create. So instead we have a virtual experience, which is exactly what the theater and the arts give us. I'm going to end with this slide. This is what engineering, in my opinion, has to learn from Boyd and the theater. We need to move from fail-safe to safe-fail. What do I mean by that? Engineering right now operates in this fail-safe mode with double redundancy emergency backup systems to ensure that our technologies could never fail. Well, until they do. You need only reference the Deepwater Horizon or any of the catastrophes that I've shown you to know that something somewhere is going to fail. We need to be okay with that failure. We need to make it safe to fail so that when it does fail, catastrophe doesn't occur. We need to move from reduction to incompleteness. The way the scientific method typically works is it's deductive. We strip out the things that we don't understand and we create knowledge within a narrow boundary that we can be confident in, that is reliable. But now we need to embrace this incompleteness. We need to include those things that we don't know enough about to be confident in. We need to move from definition to ambiguity. This is really difficult for my students. I say, you want to be one of those people that defines problems in the world or one of those people that solves them? Because the people who solve them are going cheap. There are a jillion engineers in India and China who are much better at solving problems than you are. But who's sending them these problems, I say? You're the ones who have to be comfortable with ambiguity, to look out at the ambiguous world, give it some structure, formulate the problem, and then participate in its solution. And my students all say, okay, we want to be those problem formulators. We're ready to be comfortable with ambiguity. How are we going to be greater than that? And I'm like, you're not there yet. We need to move from liability to recovery. The idea that things will always work the way that we want them to, that's an outmoded idea. Things are not going to work the way we want them to, but we need to make adjustments along the way to bring, when they do fail, to bring them back up to speed quickly. We need to move from centralized to distributed. The Industrial Revolution gave us economies of scale, and that centralization of production and authority made us rich. But it is not a way to respond to the changing environment the Industrial Revolution created. We need to move from probabilistic to possibilistic, and fiction's outstanding in this respect. Probabilistic is a risk analytic approach that says, based upon our previous experience, what can we expect the future to be like, and how do we do a cost-benefit analysis of the consequences of those risks? Possibilistic says, what kind of crazy thing could happen? Don't worry about the probability. Worry about the idea that somebody might fly jet fuel-laden airplanes into the World Trade Center, which existed in fiction, but did not exist in anybody's risk analysis. We need to be more comfortable examining the possibilities without assigning to them probabilities. And lastly, this relates to the Emerge Festival that I hope you're able to attend tonight. We need to move from specification, in which I tell you what I want to have happen in my building or on my site or my land development, to emergence. And in emergence, what I mean is we set up the conditions. We set up the boundary conditions, the initial conditions, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen in this space. It might be we build the stage, but we don't know what plays will be performed. We need to be more comfortable in engineering with allowing or assigning the preconditions that allow emergence to come forth without our vision of what that emergent thing is going to be. This is where I see, or this is what I think I and my profession have to